But you want to be a lady.
I've left everything I ever had.
I know you think I'm not half good enough
A
for
very
you.
respectable woman.
Give dinner parties and entertain your husband's friends.
I'm sure Cleopatra never bothered about
busy,
napkin
that's
rings.
all. Yes, look me.
I'm not a well-behaved.
But I want you to be absolutely perfect, you see.
Welcome to
back.
the Well-Behaved Women
Podcast musical.
Podcast musical.
Podcast musical.
The musical that's also a podcast.
But these are the research episodes.
And a podcast is also a musical, but these are research podcast episodes.
Yeah.
They're not musical episodes.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
After that really silly intro, a little bit more on a more serious note, today's episode is on some topics that are a little bit heavier. So this is a trigger warning for sexual and violent abuse, domestic abuse, and others. So if those are triggers for you, maybe skip this episode and meet us on the next one.
Yeah. But if you are ready to dive into a really important but
very important
topic,
guess what? Mennonites are pacifists, but they're not really sometimes.
So this episode, it wasn't a planned episode for us.
No.
The last episode was going to be 2 episodes, but we put it into one because we thought this was very important to talk about based off of some of the conversations that we started having.
Yeah, so there's, I guess, a difference between pacifism and non-resistance, and Mennonites began in a place of non-resistance and over time have become pacifists, but that wasn't where we started. And so these couple interviews are going to just kind of talk about what that looked like.
How that change happened. And then also, like we talk about, though, that is when people think of Mennonites, that's the thing that comes to mind is pacifism. Like that is the thing people know, the dove, right? Like it's like this idea,
peace people,
but
they
how
don't fight.
much violence is within a culture, and it's also the time period that we are specifically looking at that was more, I don't know, was it more common? Yes, I think so.
I think so, just because it was less talked about.
Yeah.
And we had a whole generation of men who were traumatized and had no ways of actually expressing feelings. Like there was not therapy. It wasn't a common thing for men to get to express their emotions in any way. So it came out in
Violence.
Abusive ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So our first guest, we're talking with Marlene Epp again, who is a professor extraordinaire
on all things Mennonite history and women and gender studies.
She's written books and essays.
And pacifism and non-resistance is a huge subject she studied.
Yeah, and so we got to ask her questions about the difference between the two.
Yeah.
And
how a peace group can be full of something that is not so peaceful.
Yeah.
So we talked with another woman about this, about her story of it, and then we noticed you wrote a book that talked about sexual violence against Mennonite women, and we were curious with one of the main points of Anabaptism and being a Mennonite is pacifism and peace. That's something that is such an important part. If you could comment on why that was, and maybe still is, but why specifically earlier on 50, 60, 70 years ago that was so prevalent in the Mennonite communities,
sexual violence,
domestic violence and domestic
we don't know domestic violence. Do we know it was more prevalent in Mennonite households than other households? I think no one's really established that. I think, but you're correct about the contradiction between Mennonite beliefs and values and then violence towards women and children. And in, the last couple of decades, there's been so much really good research and conversation and exposure of that, which is really important. And that's really influenced by the feminist movement of the 70s and onward. I view it a little bit differently. Like you talk about, Mennonites are all about pacifism and peace, and that is how their belief has evolved. But I think, in its origins, they would have described it as non-resistance, which you might know that term, like the early Mennonites. And for them, I think it very much meant not participating in the wars of the nation, so refusing military service. And that's a fairly narrow, today we would view that as a fairly narrow definition of peace and pacifism. So I think the whole idea of interpersonal violence, women and children, it probably would have been frowned upon, but I'm not convinced that, like the Anabaptists 500 years ago, or even over time, Mennonites really thought about that as being the same as refusing to join the military. And today, there's a lot of Mennonite feminist theologians who really point out that contradiction. One thing we haven't really touched at all is corporal punishment of children, which is, was like as rampant in Mennonite homes as it was in other homes, like it's other not Mennonite homes, and is still pretty significant in some, conservative communities. So this is similar to, but not quite sexual violence or sexual abuse. It's, spanking your children, and sometimes quite violently, which we don't do anymore, which is against the law in our country. But Mennonites haven't really grappled with that one either, as being a contradiction of their pacifist ideals. So, I mean, I think it was there and it was sort of condemned, but I don't think until pretty recently in the late 20th century, anyone really thought of that in the context of Mennonite peace beliefs. And that's a fairly new thing.
So like residential schools and Mennonites, we like briefly, when we were researching at one point, we like read this thing about, because I always was under the impression that like Mennonites weren't really involved with the residential schools, but then we read that they were in partner with the United Church. Yeah, partner with the United Church. As a non-resistant option. Yeah, it was like, so they didn't have to go to war, they could go work with the United Church in these residential schools. And we're just curious if you knew anything about that.
Well, there's one piece of that. So in the Second World War, when Mennonite men had the option to do alternative service to military service, some of them were placed in residential schools or day schools, but schools for Indigenous children in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. But Mennonites also, apart from, as an alternative to military service, they also ran schools especially in Northern Ontario. They viewed them as kind of mission effort initiatives, because they were government funded. Like the government was funding these for various church denominations. So like the United Church, the Catholic Church, and so on. So these were government funded schools largely, but Mennonites ran them. And how much abuse there was in Mennonite run schools, some people have done some research on that. Some insist that their schools, I mean, even if while condemning the whole residential school, principle and concept, some say Mennonite schools were not as abusive as some others. But yeah, they ran residential schools or day schools, maybe more so day schools in reserves, and tried to turn them into Christians, right? Like tried to Christianize them, and sometimes tried to make them into Mennonites. That wasn't always so successful.
Actually, interesting. We've been on a hunt to find an Indigenous person who identifies as a Mennonite, and we have like we can't find anyone. We've like,
oh my goodness. There is an absolutely wonderful book that just, well, I can tell you several. One from my local community, but who was fostered in a Mennonite home, but he doesn't call himself Mennonite. But there's a family physician in Manitoba named Brittany Penner, and she just published a memoir. So she is Cree, and was adopted by a Mennonite family in southern Manitoba as a small child, maybe even an infant or a small child, and grew up Mennonite. So I think she calls herself Mennonite. And her memoir, I just finished reading it. It's fascinating.
That would be really
So
interesting. Yeah.
there's another one who, she's a famous cellist, a musician. And why am I blanking on her name? She calls her she's Cree from Northern Alberta and Mennonite. What does she call herself? Menno Cree or something? And why am I blanking on her name? I'll think of it and I'll send it to you.
Yeah, that would be great.
We hosted her for a conference. Went before I retired at Conrad Grable, and I mean she's this two-spirit Indigenous person who, and her last name is Dirksen, Chris Dirksen. So her last name is very Mennonite.
Yeah.
But she's clearly an Indigenous person in culture mostly, but it's because she had one parent was Mennonite, one was Cree.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you want a list of these things,
Yeah,
they're out there,
This is
and
great.
that's
You have
fascinating.
the knowledge. It is very fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah. But this memoir in particular, Children Like Us, I think it was called.
Our next guest is a professor at the University of Manitoba, a professor of sociology, but she also is the co-coordinator of the Abuse and Prevention Program at MCC Manitoba.
It was a funny chat. I mean, she was great to talk to.
Yeah.
But it was funny. She was like, "Are you sure you want to interview me for a musical?" I
not sure why.
I talk about really intense things. Like, it's gonna get dark. And we're like, no. Like, that's exactly why we want to talk to you.
Yeah,
it's important.
Yeah,
we need to hear your perspective.
Yeah, so she is going to talk a lot about how present sexual abuse and violence is in the Christian world, especially in the clergy world. And this part's going to get a little heavy, so warning for you.
Yeah. So I guess how did your journey into work around sexual ethics, clergy abuse, and feminist theology take shape, and how has being a Mennonite woman influenced that?
Mm-hmm. Like, you have to know this is going to get dark, right? So when I taught Intro Soch, I always included a small section when I was teaching on the family on the reality of domestic violence. And because I was in a Christian university, I did a bit of research on what the rates were comparatively and discovered that the rates are certainly no lower in faith-based families, and actually in some contexts are higher. So that was like, wow. And then I was assigned the marriage and family class. And just from that little section in Intro Soch, I received some stories from students about their own experiences. So then when I taught marriage and family, I included a double lecture on conflict and domestic violence. Conflict is a good thing. Every marriage should have conflict. If it doesn't, I would be very worried. But how you do it, that's a different thing, right? But domestic violence is not conflict. It's categorically different. And people tend to enmesh those two. And I realize they dovetail, but they're two very different things. So I included that. And then I really started to get stories from my students. And they were stories of, a pastor uncle molesting them, a grandpa from the time they were 10, masturbating them. They were not easy stories. Boys sexually abused by their older brothers. I mean, there were lots of dark things, and they were all inside Christian churches. And what I began to stumble across was that sometimes some of these, when they were children, had told someone, and they had been told not to tell others because it was more important to protect the image of that Christian leader and that church than to care for or believe that child. So I put in a proposal to my dean to teach children in violence. So I developed a course that was just children in violence. And I should have anticipated and did not anticipate that the students who self-selected into it would be predominantly victims. But that is what happened. My first class was, I think, 19 students. And I think 17 of them, 16 of them were victims. It's not that I haven't done a lot of reading, but I'm not a therapist. So suddenly I was like, oh wow, I'm opening up all kinds of trauma inside of here. So that was a very raw and honest journey with my students, because as I realized this was turning into something other than what I anticipated, we just did that openly together, me and my students. So we took a very raw journey together as we made it through the pre-appointed course material. And by that time I was heartbroken. In the middle of all of this, my husband Jake told me he had been sexually abused by his brother. So that was a really big motivator. So I started to do public advocacy work. Providence always did public lectures, so I did lectures on the holy hush. All the rates of abuse inside churches and how it's all being hushed. And so I did a 15-minute talk, which you can watch still if you want, on the holy hush. And I did it just before lunch. And by the end of that day, because there was a few more talks after lunch, I'd have to watch the video now to recall it, but there was 4 or 5 staff and faculty who came to me to tell me about their experiences of domestic violence and sexual violence. Jamie heard one of my public lectures, who's my coworker inside of MCC's Abuse Response and Prevention Program. She came to one of my public lectures and on the spot invited me to deliver that same lecture in a pastor training course she was doing. And that's how Jamie and I met. And that's what eventually became my halftime work inside of MCC, as Jamie and I began to collaborate, because she's a trained therapist, I'm a trained sociologist. And that pairing was fruitful. Our personalities worked well together. So that course you're talking about was born out of that collaboration and is the first one in Canada. Yeah, I mean, Mennonites aren't actually pacifists when it comes right down to it. But we are one of the most generous donation areas in Canada. If a little bit of cynicism leaks out, you'll have to pardon me.
But how do you feel like the Mennonite tradition shaped teachings on sex, bodies, consent, and was it for the better or for the worse?
I mean, Mennonite teachings on sex don't have any teachings on sex other than don't have sex. So that's slightly problematic. So some of these comments are broader than the Mennonite world, but they were my Mennonite world, without a doubt. And one distinguishing feature I want to make here is I came from a home that did not actively teach religion in the home. We just sort of followed what our church said. So the ways in which I experienced my church as oppressive were not the ways in which I experienced my family or parents as oppressive. And that's just an important distinction. I had amazing upbringing. I really did. We just happened to go to a church and I was very Ernst. Okay, Ernst means like, oh, there isn't really even an English word, but like super piously sincere. But anyway, purity culture, which is the Mennonites were like big on that. And they still are. Like we're still dealing with the fallout of that. But when you teach young women that men have trouble with lust, and that it's your responsibility not to cause them to lust, you are first of all taking away their own sexual agency to lust. And the better word for that would be to experience their own growing sexuality, because that is a beautiful and a healthy thing. So the deepest message there isn't even actually about the purity piece. It's about you should be an we are already assuming you're an asexual being. You're not the one having sexual thoughts, right? That's the deepest, darkest message in that, actually. But very close second to that, of course, is your body is problematic. And so it's really important for you to hide your body. So you know that you need to, be careful about your body. And what nobody's saying out loud is obviously whatever sexual urges you're having, well, you must be the only one because they're not even telling you not to have those, right? The way they're telling the boys that. So there's these double standards. And so you lose the beauty of learning that you're a sexual being and that that's a beautiful thing to be embraced. It's a powerful thing to be handled with incredible care. It's like anger. Anger is such a good emotion, but you got to handle it with so much care or it's going to destroy you. And sex is just like that, right? But if all we get is just don't do the destroy part, right? So, I think it has done immeasurable harm to Mennonite women, in terms of our internal sexual development, like as sexual beings. So she's sinning because she inhabits the body she's in and she's got to hide it. And he's sinning because he's having sexual urges. And in that context, when you finally release two people to each other after the wedding ceremony, what you have is a disaster. It's a terrible way to do things. And this is purity culture. I mean, this is what purity culture does, right? It just gets in the way of what should have been good, healthy development. So these are the kinds of reasons I get in trouble I got in trouble at Providence. But when I would teach the sexuality unit in marriage and family, I would suggest to the students that there's intimacy and there's sexuality. And sexuality is a form of intimacy, but there's lots of other kinds of intimacy. The deep releasing of the self to another to be known for the ways we are weak, the things we're afraid of, the things we dream for, like the person we really are, right? As we slowly get to know someone, that's intimacy. So you've got, I'm gonna use my hands here. We've got intimacy and we've got sexuality. And if the intimacy gets way ahead of the sexuality, then when you eventually have sex, you won't actually know anything or be able to do that in a healthy way because you didn't let those two things grow together. If you let the sex get way ahead of the intimacy, you will have starved out the capacity for any authentic intimacy. You have to sort of keep these moving at about the same pace. And when you do that, it means you're connecting sexuality and intimacy. And you're talking about it. And you're saying, that feels a little too far for me, given the level of commitment we have with each other. Or I like it when you touch me that way, but I don't like it when you touch me that way. Like it actually puts kids in conversation with a deepening relationship with that partner so that they can get to know each other. And then, of course, the first thing all my Christian kids would say is, well, when is it too far? And my answer would always be, I can't answer that for you. You have to decide that for yourself, but the Bible doesn't actually teach that premarital sex is wrong. It teaches that porneia is wrong, which is the sale of sex. So that little misinterpreted piece of the biblical text, we're just going to, set aside here for now and concentrate on healthy sexual development. I'm sure you've read this. I'm sure you've heard this. If God is male, then male is God. And if that's where we start, there is no good place to go. If the God I pray to has to be a man, then I'm not being written into the story. I'm actively being written out of the story. And I want to live in the story. I don't want to be written out of the story. I want my story to matter just like everybody else's. Just want to be part of it. That's all. Don't need to rule. Don't need to defer. I just want to do my bit. So I actually think that naming God as both male and female is the only way we're going to pull out the taproot of patriarchy. Until our divine can be understood as both male and female, patriarchy will rule. I teach language and culture, and at Prov, I gave the students the optional assignment of spending 10 days only praying to a female god, naming her as female, only imagining a female image, and only speaking of her as female. It was optional.
Yeah.
And then they were supposed to journal about it. It was shocking how their understandings of God changed into a more conversational God, a more nurturing God, a less judgmental God. Like all our female stereotypes came into play in how they understood God. It was fascinating. I mean, just like the word Christian is such an overtired, misaligned word by now that you can hardly use it without being misunderstood. Right? So is the word feminist. It is such a misunderstood word because the range of what constitutes feminism is huge. I mean, you've got everything from the feminists who defend involvement in pornography to, feminists who have tossed all feminist theory. The range inside academia, at least, the range is so broad. It's just so convoluted by now, the whole category, that I mean, I think back to the early reformers, the women who led the abolition movement and the temperance movement, and all those fierce Christian women, among them which were Mennonites, who fought for kids not to be in factories, and then who eventually fought for the vote so that they could influence kids not being in factories and women not having to prostitute themselves on the street and all of that. That feels like the real deal to me. If you're looking for a feminist activist.
And so the next woman we got to speak to was Liz Funk.
Yeah, she's another lady from Peace Church from 52nd. That is the church that I attend and my husband is a pastor at. And she just goes into a little bit of how a lot of these older women in particular at our church and the experience in general experienced domestic abuse and were battered women by either their husbands or their fathers, just due to the situation of the world. And yeah, and how little a lot of them actually talked about it. So here's Liz Funk.
I think I was always rooting for the woman, and I wasn't too happy with a lot of the men folk, because there was a lot of flattery that was unknown. I'm sure if it was well talked about, it wouldn't have been condoned, but what do you do, Yeah, we had quite an interesting home life too, where it was very disciplined, and yeah, sometimes it was tough, but had I known that there was so many kids sort of in my age group that was happening too, and we didn't find that out until much later in life. We were all adults and things like that. We were able to talk about stuff like that. And seeing those little pamphlets in the bathroom about having a safe environment was a plus. But for that to be in a Mennonite church, I kind of
Yeah.
He might have been real hospitable, but
Yeah, where's the pacifism in that?
Oh yeah. And if you look at some of the church books, some of the clubs or vereins, there was so many ladies, like unbelievable amounts of ladies.
Yeah.
And Mum wasn't kind of part of that because of, I think, the intrinsic, I don't know, I don't want to say really shame, but of what was happening at home, being so, living in such a controlled environment, I think.
That was a lot of intense material. Robin, what is your takeaways?
Yeah, I think one thing that we didn't get to put in the episode just for sake of time was we talked to my friend Carissa Durant, and she was telling us about how white supremacy has played a role in Mennonite culture, and how the SSS has actually praised Mennonites because we have so inbred that we are more German than the Germans are. Like, we are so white. And though, like, technically it has gone beyond one, Dutch culture. it still looks very white. And there, I don't know if it's ever been actually said out loud to someone, but people marry other Mennonites. Like, it's the phrases and the phrases, and they find each other, and then and I think that is a type of violence that is important to mention, and to something to look at.
Definitely. Something that was interesting to me about this topic was the difference between pacifism and non-resistance, and that was something that I'd never really known there was a difference and what that difference was. So talking to Marlene was really interesting, and hearing that perspective of the early Mennonites weren't pacifists, they were non-resistant, and that is a key thing to understand, because that changes how you view history and how you see violence in the early days of these husbands and fathers and all that kind of thing. And I'm sure there was women as well, but this violence happening with Mennonites in the early days and now, and how that reconciles with pacifism. Well, it doesn't, and they weren't thinking of pacifism that way anyways. So it's, I think it really gave me a whole new perspective on the history, and
No, it's important. Also talking about residential schools was really important, because we so don't accept that Mennonites were a part of that. Like, it's the United Church, it's the Catholic Church.
Wasn't us.
But to, like, even though, like, and it's been said, like, I think we've talked to people, I don't think it's in this episode, but we heard where people have this idea, like, oh, like, we've lived similar lives as the indigenous people, and we've been
deculturalized, we've been forced to move,
but it's different,
not the same.
And there's so much trauma that's happened to Mennonites, but it's a different trauma, and you can't compare.
We are fully integrated into Canada and are thriving and have been given land and have been given businesses and opportunity to get educated and all these things
that have been stolen from other people,
because it was taken from the indigenous people before us.
Like, we
thrive because of them,
and we've built upon death. And so I think to, like, show that, like, Mennonites were part of residential schools, and they worked in them.
They taught at them. And there, like, to be fair, there are accounts of, like, a lot of Mennonite teachers did the best they could in a crappy situation where they were expected to be bad, and they recognized that this was a bad thing and tried to be gracious and kind teachers. But at the same time, they were still part of the problem.
Because silence is violence. So, all right.
So how does this relate to our musical? I think knowing that being a battered woman and that this was such a common thing in that time period, there's not really a way for us to get away with our character not encountering it in some way, whether she experiences it or a friend of hers experiences it. We need to have that involved in some way and touched on in some way, and, like, hopefully not in a way that makes it really, like, down and sad and depressing, but to be able to, like, put a voice to this thing that was silenced and kept so hush hush, I think is important.
Because we don't want to not share an honest story, and, like, we both approach things very lightly in life, so we're gonna talk about things in a light way, a playful way, I think, and when you're singing about things, like, it's always playful, even when it's intense.
And it might not be, like, a major point in the story either. It might just be something that's, like,
aside,
briefly mentioned at some point, but we do want to make sure it is mentioned, because if we're going to talk about the average Mennonite woman's experience, that seems to be part of it.
So thanks for bearing with us in this conversation.
Depressing topic.
Hopefully you can go take care of yourself if you need to. Go for a walk or something. Make a
Mm-hmm.
cup of tea.
Go chat with someone if you need to.
All right.
Bye.